Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gwendolyn Reese. I am the High Priestess of Theophania, which is a coven of the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel. And thank you so much for joining me today. We are in Module 3 of our Foundations of the Craft course, and we are about to start the section on theory. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started. All right. So this module, we're going to talk a little bit about moving metaphysics now into more magic. And I'm going to do a quick review of some of the metaphysics with a little bit of additions. And we're going to talk some about the planes. Then we're going to talk about the powers, and by which in this case, I mean the elements, the elementals, and the guardians, the directions. Then we're going to talk about thought forms. So a couple of quick reminders from some of the earlier pieces that are directly related to this. So first of all, we need to remember in this way of thinking, every single thing has consciousness. All the different levels of reality, they all have consciousness. All beings have consciousness. Also, I want to remind us, I'm going to jump down a little bit, that, we're talking about an emanatory scheme in which you have that which is neither being nor non-being, and this gradual descent into casting on the mantles of density, which way in which we can think about this is that it is all vibration. So everything is vibration, is energy, and it is conscious. So as we are descending down into vibration, and of course, you can think of this as a metaphor, but I think it may not be a metaphor. One of my biggest realizations in magic was some things you're like, oh, that's a metaphor. It's like, oh no, it's actually not a metaphor. So when we talk about the song of the cosmos, and most esoteric traditions also have a tradition of sound cosmology, where there is like the sacred syllable or the song goes out, because song and sound is something that we can perceive as vibration, that it goes out and it comes all the way down, and that is the creation of everything. Okay, so think of it as musical scales then. Everything, nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. That's an aphorism from the Kabbalion. And you can be thinking of it as coming down through scales, and in those scales, those notes, so the scales repeat, right? So there's these repeating patterns as they are coming down, and that you will have the different notes in those scales will have sympathetic resonance with the ones in the other scales that are of the same note, just at a different octave. Okay, so that's important for us to be thinking about, because we use that sympathetic resonance and also this idea of the scales with the octaves. So this is, again, there's a, this is the macrocosm is reflected in the microcosm is reflected in the macrocosm at all levels. So this is when we say as above, so below, as below, so above. All right. So now there are also some additional characteristics that have to do with this vibratory understanding of reality. One of them is about polarity. And we often talk about, polarity as being those things. There's a polarity that's active and one that is receptive. So, that's when we use positive and negative in that way. It's not a value judgment thing. It's like, the poles on a battery. So that would be like a type of polarity. There's also this idea that when you're looking at poles, that opposites are identical in nature but different in degree. This also comes from the Kabbalion, which has a number of aphorisms that are quite interesting. So this is like something like, for instance, when you are dealing with hot and cold, there's no such thing as exactly just hot and cold. It's like they are hot and cold in relation to each other. So it makes for a dynamic polarity, but where exactly that is, it's always relative. And, that's an important thing to understand, because if you have something where you want to make something more cold, or more hot, then you kind of play around with the opposite pole. So here we are, we're too cold, so you add more heat to drag it, if that makes sense. So a little bit there. Also, we're going to talk more about rhythm later, but everything has ebbs and flows. There's always these cycles. So when we're talking about all of reality as kind of a song, songs also have rhythm. So they have vibration, but they have rhythm. And so there is also an aspect of this that there is always rhythm accompanying the vibration. And a large part of the life of a witch is understanding cycles, all of these different cycles, and there are tons and tons of them, and living consciously with them. And then there's another aspect that I'm going to call synergy. Sometimes it's called gender, but I don't like that framing because I think it gets us too limited in our understanding. The idea here is it also could be understood as harmonics. Again, if we're thinking of all of reality as a song, there are times in which you can take vibrations and put them together. And what you get is greater than the sum of the parts. That's really what we're talking about. So, it's when you add two different things together and what you get is greater than the sum of the parts. So there's a principle there. And like I said, to me, you can also think of this in terms of harmonics. So that's a quick review of some of the metaphysics. Now I want to go through a little bit more about planes of existence. Okay, so talked about the scales. Scales all the way down from the highest vibration to the lowest vibration. Of course, our definition of a human being, and a human being is any being at any time, in any place, wearing any body, in which highest spirit and the lowest matter are joined at the plane of mind. So human beings exist on all the entire spectrum of range of vibrations, but our growth is at the plane of mind. So when we talk about planes, this can get a little confusing because I'm now talking about scales and planes. Really what we mean by that is that wherever your attention is focused, those things that are in a similar range of vibration will have a tangibility at that plane. That's why we kind of think of them as planes. They're everything is vibration, but like when you are focused, and it's kind of like if you think about this in a dream, right? When you are focused in a dream, you're in that dream. What happens in that dream has a tangibility because it's happening at the same level. Your attention is focused at the same level of vibration as what is going on there. So that's kind of why we think about it sometimes in terms of planes. It's to emphasize that kind of tangibility because it's, it is real and it's tangible at that same level. Okay. It is also important to note that while, there's lots of different ways to divide these up and name them and think about them, numerous systems. There's Kabbalistic ways, Neoplatonic, there's, Theosophy has some, all of that. The scales are real. How you want to exactly divide up and talk about it and name it and label it, secondary. You got to have some way of talking about it though. It's also not anthropocentric. So all things exist on all these different levels. So for example, we're going to talk about us because that's really easy for us to understand. But just, when we start off talking about the physical, I want you to remember that the physical body of a great being like the sun is actually the whole solar logos. It's the entire solar system. And that entire solar system is its body. It exists, this great, beautiful being of which we are a part, exists also on all the other lanes. It also has a mind. It also has spirit. It also has an astral form. So, all of these different things, it's existing on all these different levels. Okay. So it's not anthropocentric. All right, so I've put some up here that we kind of use in common parlance as an attempt to kind of help us just have some thoughts around it. As I said, physical, got the physical body. I think we know what those are, physical body. Now, you can complicate your relationship, which is a very interesting thing to do because we'll remember that infinity goes in both directions. And while you can go way, way, way up into infinity, you can also, if you start looking at the tiny, tiny, tiny and the space between the molecules, the space between those, you can get to infinity going down and suddenly you're like, is my body anything? And that is a worthwhile thing to go do. But at the moment, we're just going to use this as kind of like, this is our physical reality. The etheric, whenever you hear the word etheric, what we mean by that is that this is the model pattern. This is the level, it's more subtle. So subtle is just what we use. We talk about the subtle realms. It means the non-physical. So this is the first of those subtle realms, and it is the level of the model body. So if you've ever encountered anyone who's talked about people who have lost a limb and have phantom limb kind of perceptions, that's because the etheric limb is not lost. So that's still there. So that's the piece that we're talking about. Now, some of the places in which you can perceive this more directly, if you have someone that you can work with where you can go have that person stand up against a blank wall. And then if you've ever used those like magic eye things with the dots and the random pictures in there, there's a kind of feeling in which you allow your vision to go sort of soft and unfocused a bit. And like if you manage to do this, hold on to that thought or that perception of how this feels in your body, because that's the same kind of thing you're going to want to do to see at the etheric level. But you will often find over their shoulder, and it's the easiest way to do it, put somebody up against a blank wall, and over their shoulder you will often begin to perceive, if you just kind of like let yourself go, a light. It's like a rim around there. And a lot of times it's kind of like white or gray or sometimes green, and you can kind of start to perceive that way. But all living things have this. So that's the etheric. Now, a couple of things, if you are, you find yourself being really interested in healing, a lot of work is often done at the etheric level, because the etheric is, as I said, it's the model body. So it's kind of got the pattern that all of the little bits in the physical go and fill in to a certain extent. It like holds the cohesion, but it also means that that is where it's very susceptible to damage from a lot of negative emotions. So this is, we would say, part of the teleology of stress-related illness. And it's also very susceptible to damage from the environment, from environmental toxins, be they physical or like feeding up that way, or kind of etheric environmental toxins. So this is often where there's problems in the etheric body, or often where a lot of healing needs to be done. Now, the astral is where we as witches spend a lot of time. So the astral, the easiest way to kind of quickly grasp the astral is that when you are in dreamland, when you are in the land of dreams, that is the astral. And that's where you go most naturally. And when you are there, again, like I said, you know, when you are there, everything that is operating at that level where your attention is, it has tangibility. So the astral is one of the form areas. So you're still perceiving in form. So when you have the beautiful goddess that comes to you, when you have the terrible monster, when you have whatever, that's all, you know, that's probably the astral. And astral itself just means starry. And, you know, it gets used for like actually a really huge range of stuff. It's kind of a use name for a really long list, or a very large chunk of vibrations that, you know, other systems might break it up into multiple. But how we're going to use it right now is you're dealing with form. If it is beautiful, if it is pretty, if it is hideous, if it is ugly, it still has form, and therefore that's where you are, as long as it's not just straight up geometric. So that's yeah. So when you're in dream, when you're in the astral, you find that things are very responsive to your thoughts. They suddenly, like, you think of something and it just kind of moves, and it also is very fluid. It can move and change in ways that obviously in the physical world it cannot. The other thing to note is that this is where we do, like when we're doing a lot of our shamanic work, as we call it that, you know, we talk about the metaphor of journeying. You're already there, but the process of going through an imaginative journeying process is actually, it works as a technique to shift your attention into that level of being, because you're already existing there, but you're often not like attentive there. Another thing is that, you know, this is where we often do a lot of our work with, like, working with inner plane temples, where we may encounter inner plane teachers. This is a really good, important meeting place for an awful lot of beings that do not naturally have lower bodies. So, for example, this is where we will often encounter and interact with our gods, is at this level of being. And I mean, are they capable of coming fully down? Probably. I mean, I would, as I certainly everything that I have ever understood, yeah. And there are possessory types of rituals in which they inhabit somebody else's body for a bit. And there are in all traditions instances in which they seem to have become fully manifest in the physical world. But most of the time, what's happening, especially if you're a magical practitioner, is that you're able to shift up into the astral and encounter them there. And so that's usually where this happens. And they are usually taking the shape of what we call a god form, which is, it's not their natural form, because their natural form is way up on the spiritual. But the God form is how they can interact with us. And it's a co-created kind of clothing, if you will. And by co-created, I mean like human cultures have created this vessel in conjunction with them partially creating it. So you're never going to have, for instance, the Asclepius is never going to take on a form that would be more appropriate for like Aries. It's not going to happen. So, but these co-created forms, this is where the gods usually come in, and then we're interacting with them from there. Like I said, it's also where we interact with a lot of our spiritual teachers. It's where we can interact with some of our beloved dead. Those of us who do a lot of this kind of magic, we can create or find and locate and go to inner plane. And by inner plane here, I really do mean astral temples or meeting grounds. So it's got good interface there. And like I said, this is still, though, everything has some sort of form. So this is a huge, huge area, and it's where we do a lot of magic. It is important to remember that the more rarefied or fine, higher vibration tends to be causal to the lower. So one of the reasons we do so much work in the astral is that it can be causal in terms of sending down the patterns into the etheric that then become the model for what we want to have happen in the physical. So, okay. Now, the mental, when we are operating in the mental aspects, and we're in the mental plane. So when you're there at that level, things are very tangible. But this is where we begin to head into what in the Indian traditions they would call the arupa, the formless. So in the lower aspects of the mental, this is where you get things, you're like dealing with the lower mental when all of a sudden things just start looking very geometric rather than like pretty forms of, well, I guess geometric forms can be pretty, so that's not a good way of putting it. This is where you're seeing straight up geometry and geometric forms and things that are very mathematical, versus kind of things that look like some version of what you could be seeing more down in a physical way. So when you start encountering things that are like that, you're dealing with some of the lower mental kind of form stuff. And then you get into the totally formless. And then everything above that, it's really more formless. However, that doesn't mean it doesn't have the sensation of tangibility. So, for example, one of the things that I love, and I'm not able to do this like all the time, this is one of those things that I have to really work with. I love really difficult philosophy. I love it because it is formless. It is really formless. And there are moments in which I'm trying to encounter these very formless, abstract thoughts where some aspect of myself that is at the same kind of wavelength has a sensation that really feels like grasping the idea. And I mean that in a very visceral way. There is a moment in which my mind is able to go grasp. And when I get that sensation, I know I'm operating well on that level and I'm able to like grab it. And so that's up into the arupa, the formless aspect of the mental. And our job as humans is to try to get better and better and more active at enlivening and using that aspect of self. And then we talk about the spiritual. The spiritual is above that. We have some senses of it. It comes through us sometimes, and it goes all the way up into the ultimate unity. But again, that is all going to be arupa. That is going to be formless. So, you know, when you're having the God coming and telling you something and you're perceiving them, and it's a beautiful goddess and she's telling you things that are very wise and very loving, that's still the astral, because that's still got form. And that doesn't mean it's not incredibly valuable. And in fact, all of these things that are these high spiritual aspects, they have to get eventually stepped down into the point where we can grasp them in ways all the way through and enact them. Otherwise, they're just kind of playing around up there. But that can be very true. It can be very wise. So it's not like things in the astral cannot have deep spiritual wisdom. But if you're encountering them in a God form that's telling you something, you're not actually directly encountering them. Now, I'm going to give you one of the things that I'm going to say here is it is very, very important for all of us to constantly pay attention in all of our different aspects of self to how things feel when we are encountering them. So I mentioned this idea of like, there's a moment in which my mind goes grasp, because then I've been able to grasp it at that visceral reality and I know what that feels like now. So pay attention. Another one for the spiritual stuff is that there is this feeling, and it's a tangible, visceral, experiential situation that I get, again, like not super often, but when I've gotten it, it's really visceral. And it's a feeling that I can only describe as the realization that this is something I have always known, but I didn't realize it until right now. And that, to me, it's signifying something that's coming from that higher spiritual as it's hitting the mental. And it's usually very abstract. And then as I get that, I'm pulling it down into the lower. So again, there's a very particular kind of visceral sensation that is going on. So you want to be paying attention to that with anything. Okay, let's move on. Let's go into the elements. Now the elements, and I'm talking here about the classical elements. They're called the classical elements. So earth, air, water, fire, spirit. Spirit, fire, air, water, earth is probably the better way of saying that. So if we remember, everything is conscious and everything's alive. So if that's the case, the elements are like the lives. They're like the primordial lives that make up everything else. So they are in everything and they make up everything. So they're like these foundational lives. And their type of consciousness is so vast. It is so vast that we tend to only pick and get into relationships with certain parts of them. So we're talking about huge, huge consciousness here. So I want to talk quickly about the history of where this kind of understanding comes from. So historically, our first articulation of, again, what we call the classical elements comes from some of the pre-Socratics, and they were Eleatic. So that's like in the part of Greek culture that was in what we would now understand as part of Italy, because, things change. And so the pre-Socratics, basically, their big question here is they're like, given that everything we observe is this constant state of change and everything is always in the process of becoming something else, what then is the true nature of reality? That's what they're trying to understand. As part of their understanding, one of the quick things that they said is the evidence of the senses is at best incomplete. So they're beginning to try to use, and ultimately what they're really using is that vehicle of mind. To try to understand it, the abstract thought, to try to get at this. And some of the ones that are coming up with these initial ideas are Thales, Anaximenes, Anaximander, Meletus, and Heraclitus. So later then, so this is all in the pre-Socratics. Later, Aristotle adds the concept of ether as the fifth element, and we'll go into a bit more about that. So that is later. Now, these ideas then spread to India, and from India in through Buddhism. So one of the things that I think we just need to take a quick historical side note on, because I think we have an educational system that gives us very, very skewed and dramatic misunderstandings about a lot of things, is, it is a very dangerous thing to project our own categories and understandings about the way in which cultures work back onto the ancients. So the ancient Greek, ancient Hellenic cultures were in direct contact with Egypt, with huge chunks of Africa, with pretty much all of the Near East, and these very advanced Near Eastern cultures. They were up into, like, Marseille was originally in France, was originally in a Greek colony. There were, Greek colonies all over in Africa and Asia, up into like Odessa. So on the Black Sea was another one. So, I mean, they were like all over, and all over that area. And they had trade relationships with India long before Alexander. And then by the time of Alexander, they were actually in direct contact throughout all of that with India and various Indic traditions. So they are not isolated at all. And they would see themselves as far more immediately in common with many of the cultures of Africa, the Near East, India, than they would with, like, Vikings. So, because they've been in contact, since, like I said, since the Stone Age with many of these groups, and then definitely from the Bronze Age. So these are the kind of cultural overlaps. So what we have here is that this kind of understanding and this contemplation about the elements and the way in which we understand them is one of the things that goes from Greece over into India, probably along with astrology, which had come into Greece from Babylonia, and then had gotten through some changes there, and then is going over into India, where it has further elaboration. The Greeks and the Indians, and Greek culture and Indian culture in particular, are very philosophical. That's part of their foundational makeup. And so then you have the continued elaboration in these various groups of additional speculation. But when Christianity cuts off through threat of, and actually inaction of, a lot of violence, cuts off the Greek philosophical kinds of traditions, then the contact also gets severed. So then they tend to grow in different directions. So anyway, the understanding of the elements spreads over into India, and there's a lot in terms of India and Buddhist that I find very valuable there. And then there's this other part that after the severing of this speculation away from its roots and the domination of Christianity, it still does continue in the Christian cultures over in Europe, but now separated from the developments in India. But it continues within the context, especially of ceremonial magic and alchemy. The other thing to just note is then there's the Chinese system of foundational elements, which I believe has a totally different history and is not therefore something that I am covering. But I do think there's a lot there to see in the Indic, which actually in a lot of ways is closer aligned to some of the ancient classical understanding. Anyway, so when we're talking about the elements, though, we have a propensity to think of them in mostly relationship to human psychological stuff, like, oh, my passion is very fiery and all that kind of thing. And okay, so that's true, but they are way, 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 way more than that. They're huge, big, cosmic level things that we're talking about. And, there is, like I said, macrocosm is reflected in the microcosm, microcosm is reflected in the macrocosm. So it's a useful thing to think about it in terms of how it works with us, but it's just not complete. So let's talk a little bit more about that. But first, let us remember that all things in the manifested universe are made up of all of the elements. Okay. I'll talk about fire first. So the Greek word dynamis to me is like the essence of fire. And dynamis is where we get dynamism, dynamic, dynamite. But the idea here is it's like that, it's that motion, power, movement kind of, it's power. And it's also therefore the animating life force. The dynamis is that, it's just the almost like liquid life. It's not really liquid, but you know what I mean. It's like, it's the animating life force. And like I said, that is power. And it is related to the idea of will, because will is basically this as well. So we mentioned the passion. There's relationship, of course, with light. Now, when you have, one of the things that can be useful to try to understand these is to think about, how does fire manifest on all these different aspects and levels of being? So to me, and I should point out here, I hope that you all do your own investigation. A lot of these are out of my investigation. So I'm not asking you to necessarily just adopt this. What I think is far more important is to go out and try to have an understanding, an experiential contact with these various elements. But when you take this, like the dynamis, the power, and you experience it at the level of mind, the ability to be like, focus, to me, that's hugely fire oriented. But you can also think, one of the things about fire as we're thinking about it is, think about like, fire can manifest as a candle flame, a hearth fire, the sun, a forest fire, one of this cataclysm stuff. One of the things to note is that fire likes to be active. And so the nature of fire is this real activity, and it likes to be active. And so that's when fire can get out of control really fast, because it just loves to ramp up. That's part of its nature. So as I mentioned, it has a positive polarity in that it is very active, and it is frequently associated with the south. Now, the alchemical symbol for fire is a point up equilateral triangle. Now, air is directly related to consciousness. And so, there's also this interesting thing about like it's breath, and there's the life breath. And I want to point out the Greek word pneuma. It means wind, breath, consciousness. It means all these different things. But it's not like it is a word addressing three different things. These are all the same thing. And I think that's something that's important, as like, if you meditate on that a bit, it will help a lot in the understanding of the element of air. So it is mind and all of mind's activities. Now, in the Indic tradition and in the ancient Hellenic, the ancient Greek, emotions are also part of mind, and so they're also air. That's now in the current Wiccan tradition, we put a lot of that into water, like emotions are watery. But in the Indic, and I actually tend to go a little bit more with this, honestly, here, I think it's still part of consciousness, part of mind. But one of the things that I want us to think about here is that with air, you're not typically aware of it except through its interactions with other things or through its absence. And if you think about the nature of consciousness, the nature of mind, you're not often aware of it except for its interactions with other things or its absence. So, just play around with some of this kind of thinking. It also has a positive polarity in that it is active and is sometimes considered the lower octave of fire. And the alchemical symbol is that point up with a line through it, point up triangle with a line through it. And it is associated with the East, the power of the East. Now, water is the first kind of substance, primordial substance. And I think of it, honestly, as blood. And like water itself here, physical water is the blood of the planet. And what I mean by this is that it is the medium through which it conveys life and conveys all of the messages of life itself. So to me, it's like water is what is actually conveying the fire and the power of fire and the power of air in life, right? So if you think about the way in which blood works, It also has a lot to do, I think, with some of the cycle part and the rhythm part. Now, if you think about like the heart, and I'm gonna ask us to consider, and this is a Gwendolyn soapbox. I want us to resist the false dichotomy of head versus heart. This is a very new thing, and by new, I think it's probably like maybe 500-600 years old, something like that. I think it's very destructive. I don't think there is a dichotomy between the head and the heart, because I have often been told, and this is why I'm resisting this, because I think it's wrong and destructive. Like, oh, you're too heady, not enough heart, or too whatever. And it's like that. I just think that's nonsense. And again, I think that the Eastern tradition of putting emotions in air, I think, is actually accurate. So that's part of my own thing, but I just think it's like, this is not, they're not a dichotomy, and there are different ways of being. But what I do think is really truly water is, I do think compassion is, and that wisdom in a different way is, because I think what those are coming from. So what you have in water is this idea of this constant change. Everything is shifting and changing and transforming into each other. And you have the medium that is providing the ability for communication and life, like the messages and the life force. And therefore, part of what you've got is then the experiential understanding of interconnectedness, interrelatedness, and the unity of things. And I think that then is the wisdom, is kind of the living, it's like the experiential recognition of that, which by definition is going to lead you into compassion. So I do think those things to me make a lot of sense in water. And if that's what people mean by heart, fine. But I think that we have a difficult discourse there that comes out of, frankly, a lot of misogyny. So anyway, there's a compassion, wisdom, all of these things, that deep inner knowing that comes from that experience of interrelatedness and unity and difference. In the Indic tradition, because if you think about water, it always takes a shape of whatever it's in. So it doesn't, it's substance, but it doesn't really have its own shape so much. So this constant shifting and changing, they put the water as where the body is. In Wiccan traditions, we usually think of the body as being as part of earth, but in the Indic traditions, they emphasize the changeability, the mutability, and the lack of permanence. So that goes into water. It is a negative polarity. And again, we don't mean positive or negative here in any kind of judgment, but in terms of like, it is receptive. It's taking the shape. And it is associated with the West. Earth. All right. First of all, we are not talking about the planet, the Earth. We are not talking about Gaia. We're talking about something that's much bigger than the planet. So we're really talking about kind of anything. It's the foundation, the stability, actually the principles of stability and solidity. And to me, Earth really has to do with holding power. It's when something is like got the pattern and it's holding it. So this is where we, the others, they're all moving, shifting, changing. This is like, we're now trying to hold still and hold pattern. And that stillness, the holding, this is also a lot of times I think why we get like the dark and silence are often considered part of like the power of Earth. It also is why it's strength. I think of fire as power, but like this kind of holding firm, holding pattern, holding form. That's really what strength is. And again, we often in Wicca think about it in relationship to the body, but in the Indic traditions, which put the body in the West, the underlying substrate of deep consciousness, that's the underlying substrate of deep consciousness is what the Indic traditions, such as Buddhism, put there. Again, it is the negative polarity and is receptive, and it's the lower octave of water. So the alchemical symbol, I think I forgot to tell you, in water, it's the triangle again, but it's point down. And then in Earth, it's point down with the line. All right. Now, Aristotle is the first one who talked about ether in the Hellenic tradition. And basically there's not total consistency in the fifth element, but part of this also has to do with the way in which the word spirit gets used in English for a whole variety of things. So it's not very specific as a word. But in a lot of ways, what we can think about this is it is the unity from which all proceed, and it's also the medium in which everything, all those other elements interact. So the word ether, it means the clear sky. And it's the classical, what they call the quintessence. And quintessence, of course, Latin, it just means the fifth essence, the fifth element. The other Greek, well, Latinized Greek word that gets used for it is empyrean. And what that really means is, unlike the other four, which are kind of shifting and changing, even Earth with its holding power, it can't hold indefinitely. It is not subject to change. So they say that the spirit, the ether, is not subject to change. In the Indic traditions, they hold that the fifth element is space. And the word that is used is akasha, which also means sky, interestingly. And again, it is the medium of beingness and is related to sound. So I think that kind of idea of the medium of beingness is, and the idea of space, it helps me understand a little bit more about what we mean when we're talking about spirit or ether as one of the elements. So I want to talk quickly about the tattvas. Now the tattva, it's a Sanskrit word. It means the elements. So that's really what it means. But when we tend to use it in Wicca, we're often meaning it in terms of very specific glyphs that are used to access or invoke awareness of particular elements that are borrowed. And this whole thing is borrowed from the Indic traditions. So the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, of which Theophania is a coven of the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, we do actually use the Indic tattvas and the colors from the tattvas for the elements. Now, there are various other traditions that will use different colors associated with the different elements. Some of the most common, probably the most common, would be to use yellow for air. It would be to use red for fire, which everybody uses red for fire. That's like the one that doesn't shift and change around. To use blue for water and to use green for earth. But in a moment here, we're going to go through the tattvas and the colors that are used by the assembly. So basically, though, you can use these different glyphs to connect with the different elements. You can stack them up, pile them up in your visualization on yourself to pull in conscious awareness of the way in which all of these work and align in your own body. There's lots of different ways of doing this. And here they are. So in the tattva tradition, and therefore the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, we use the blue circle for air. And so blue is the color of air. And the red triangle for fire, red is the color of fire. The silver crescent for water, so silver or sometimes kind of gray, but that kind of color there is for water. The yellow square is for earth. And then the black egg is for spirit, ether. So those are the colors that are used. Every now and then you'll find like white also for spirit, ether. But yeah, there we go. Now, as I mentioned, the elements are these huge cosmic beings. And as such, they can be a little difficult to like fully grasp. But there are elementals also. I want to talk about the elementals here. So the elementals are beings that are evolving towards coming into full manifested form. In other words, these are beings that have not yet ever experienced like life all the way down to the physical plane. If you think about that, like the descending scales on that level. Okay, so now there are beings who are evolving. These are the beings that are evolving towards coming into manifested form. There are beings who are no longer manifesting physically. These are beings that have, learned everything that they need to know down in like the fully manifested reality, and they have other things to do, and they don't come all the way down. So like I said, one of the things about the astral, where we often will meet a lot of the spirits and work with them, it's because they don't always have vehicles that are more dense. But those are beings, when we're doing that, typically that have come through and they've gone through the evolutionary process, and they no longer require a physical body to do their work. They have learned the lessons. The elementals have not come in. They have not yet manifested physically. And part of what that means is that they don't have self-consciousness yet. Because one of the things that's one of the biggest lessons about coming in and getting one of these physical bodies is these physical bodies that we are in, they give us this illusion of separation and like a shell around us, which is necessary for the perspective of developing as the spark of the divine self-consciousness. Because part of our work is to take this understanding of ourselves and then reunify, become larger again, but without the great mystery is losing our sense of self. But they don't yet have that. They haven't had that experience. So they're not self-conscious. And as they are coming in, then as they're coming down into this very scales, their evolutionary lesson, wherever they are, is to learn how to hold form at the level of vibration that they are currently existing, and to do that really, really well. And then they can go into the next set of growth and learn how to do that really, really well, all the way down until they finally hit the physical plane, and they've really learned how to hold form at that point. So that's their lesson, is learning how to hold form. So especially those that are like earlier in their path, they're more recently kind of emanated. And they in particular, so they have particularly strong affinity to one of the elements. A little bit, they haven't experienced as many different things yet. And basically the way in their job, like I said, is to learn how to hold form. So they are the lives that embody any of those ideas that are generated at the level of whatever place they are on this process of coming into coming down into further and further into manifestation, or into physical form. They're really just coming into more dense form. They're in manifestation. They're coming into greater density. Okay. So, you know, when you're in a dream and you have a thought, and then something gives it like that shape, that form, well, that's an elemental that is giving it that shape, that form. You're the one that created the thought, but it's what's like making it manifest there. Okay. So that's what elementals are doing. Now, we have some names for different types of elementals. And these names that we have come from Paracelsus. I believe he's 15th century alchemist. And Agrippa before him discussed the 4 categories, but did not name them. So the names that we have for the ones that are closely associated with particular elements are, for air, the sylphs; for fire, salamanders; for water, the undines; and for earth, gnomes. Now, what I'm going to say to you is this: as you're learning the elements and learning how to relate to the elements, it is easier in many ways to relate with some of the elementals and to get to know them through that. It's a little bit easier to actually, now they're not going to tell you anything that they don't know because they don't have self-consciousness. It's got to be in their experience, but you can have some communication with them that way. That's one of the ways to do that. You can also call upon them to aid you in various kinds of things, or to bring particular kinds of gifts. Again, that's, you know, we work with elementals all the time. The other way is to really work with the elemental rulers. Now, the elemental rulers, like I said, the elementals themselves are not yet self-conscious, but there's these great intelligences that are kind of like group consciousness of the elementals, and they are on the far side of evolution. In other words, there's some of the ones that don't have like their full physical body yet, because they've been through all that. So we're talking about very evolved beings here, and they stand as these great cosmic beings. And you can also develop relationships with them, and on occasion we will call them into some of our bigger work. And the names, the main names that Wiccans use for this, which comes out of some of the ceremonial traditions, are: for air, Peralda; for fire, Jinn; water, Nixa. There's lots of different ways to spell Nixa; earth, Gob. Now, one of the things that we often do is we will cast a circle in order to create a container for magic. And we will call on the elementals, and sometimes call on the guardians at each of the quarter to it when we open the gates. And the quarters that we might call on the elemental rulers, which I just mentioned, such as, or the watchtowers. Hail to thee, watchtowers of the east, powers of air, I call you into the circle, that kind of thing. Okay. Another way to do it is to call the winds. And now the winds, obviously, they all have an air kind of aspect to them regardless, but they also, because of the directions, they do actually tend to also have some of the elements. So this would be like if I were to call on Zephyros, that would be, he's the western wind. And so he's got kind of a watery wind aspect to him, or Boreas, which is in the northern wind. He's got kind of an earthy, there's kind of an earthy cold, he's very cold, wind aspect to that. So also, if you work with any of the Buddhist tantric traditions, there are cosmic Buddhas of the elements and of the directions. And I actually have used them. I actually, in a lot of ways, I don't know if they're the same beings as the elemental rulers or not. There are times in which I call on the elemental rulers, and maybe it's the my mind, but sometimes they show up as the cosmic Buddhas anyway. So, but you can use those as well. So now I want to talk quickly about thought forms. I'm talking about the elementals, right? So human minds are almost always working. And so we're almost always creating these thought forms. And whenever we have a thought, often it's like at the astral level, sometimes it can be on that really, really high, totally arupa, formless kind of thing at the higher levels, but something gives them form. And that something is one of the elementals. So most of our thoughts are so the elementals, again, if you think of them as kind of like the plastic nature of reality. So they're what, gives, you have a thought and it's like what gives it form. Most of our thoughts are very cloudy, unfocused, and dissipate quickly. And given the quality of most humans' thoughts, that's probably a good thing. So like I said, when you have a thought, the elementals give it form on the inner planes. And so there are a number of different ways in which those thought forms can gain more stability. And one of the most important is repetition. A repeated thought gains stability. It gains clarity and it gains stability. Another is you can do work in which you are intentionally feeding various thoughts. Powerful emotions will certainly often give a lot of like this juice for them, a lot of power, oomph there. And one of the things to note is that strong thoughts draw more elemental power to them and they get ever stronger. So your personal character in no small way gets constructed out of what thought forms are in your personal astral mental space. And that is a good thing and a bad thing. It is something, this is where, because part of being a witch is to co-create, it's to grab power. And if you understand this is the case, then you can use this to create what you want. So some of the magical implications here is that you want to make sure that the thought forms that you're having, the thoughts that you're having, that you're not filling up your personal astral with unwholesome thoughts. So this is not to say, this is not about guilt. It's not about feeling bad. It's about taking inventory and deciding what you want. So what I want you to do here is note your repeated thoughts. I mean, all of us have some problematic repeated thoughts. When you encounter them and you're like, aha, I now see that I'm doing this, and that is not what I want, then remember that inattention starves. You want to starve and replace. On the other hand, when you're doing your inventory and you're like, that is a thought I want to build, then you create patterns in which you're going to build them. So that's part of it. It's just, first of all, become aware of what it is that you are doing without awareness so that you can be aware and make decisions. Like I said, it's not about guilt, it's about choice. So the next thing is you can start building what it is that you want. So I am a big fan of fretting spells. That's where you take like your mala or whatever, and you create a very short kind of thing that encapsulates the thought that you want to build. And you just go through it. You say it over and over and over and over again. And that's the repetition. It begins getting it more clear, getting it more energy. Another one is that you can work on, and I really encourage you, find some dream, something that you really want to do, something you really want to have happen. And, try and keep it like personal for right now. It's great to want to like change the world and all that, but like, you change the world by changing you. So think of something that you want to manifest and then work on really developing that idea, developing the thought. And I mean, like, use your art. Figure out, like, create something out of art that says, tell stories about it, write it down, imagine it coming true, build in with as much clarity as you can, create an object that every time you see it, you think about that thought. Put it somewhere where you'll see it so that you're constantly working that. Practice gratitude around it. Call to the specific elements and ask them to bless your dream into fruition in very specific ways. So you build clarity and you feed it. And, I would just do something like that as an experiment. Because magic to me really is primarily about consciously being a co-creator of reality, is taking that power. So I'm going to invite you here to get to know the elements, spend a week or a month or a cycle getting to know and build a relationship with each of the elements. Do them one at a time. So do the elements. So like I'm doing fire. So I'm going to try to understand fire. I'm going to experience fire. I'm going to like take notes on it. I'm going to write down, like, I'm going to try to experience the jinn at the same, the salamanders at the same time and build a relationship with jinn. So, work one at a time to really kind of try to understand. Also, start tracking the content of your repeated and powerful thoughts. Remember, one of the reasons why because anger can call up fire elementals, and fire elementals, man, they just like to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So, trying to think through that way also. Think through your repeated thoughts and what are the main elemental kinds of aspects there. And then intentionally start building a thought form for something you really want. So that is this session, and I hope that it's been useful for you. And I look forward to seeing you again. And the next one will be the praxis section.